Okay, so today on Ancient DOS Games, we're covering a title which, quite frankly, isn't really deserving of the full ADG treatment, as it's buggy, unfinished, and nothing more than a glorified RPG combat engine. That game being Shadow Knight. In fact, I don't even remember how I came into possession of this game back as a kid, but I did indeed have it back then. I don't think it was a registered copy, as I'm sure not playing a registered copy here either, but then, did registered copies even exist? I mean, it's hard to know, really. For all intents and purposes, this is a shovelware title. It was dumped onto a BBS in the 90s to drum up support and cash despite the game not being ready to launch and despite the two other titles noted in the game's catalog not even existing. In fact, looking back on how this was made, the kinds of bugs it has, some of the words which are not spelled right in some places but spelled right in others, this kind of feels like a game that was put together by a teenager, as it very much reminds me of the kind of quality of stuff I myself was making back when I was a kid. And I think that's why I gravitated towards this thing back then, because it was exactly the kind of game I would have wanted to make myself. And then ultimately did. Shadow Knight was developed and released by two guys calling themselves Moretech Software, David Bartel and Marcel Broski. Released sometime in 1994, and is effectively a one-player turn-based simulation game, though if you want to get super accurate, it's effectively an RPG battle engine simulator. Now, it primarily runs in an 80 by 25 text mode, though you can set the game up to switch to an 80 by 30 VGA text mode during combat if you want to, but this does absolutely nothing special other than adding a bunch of extra unused space at the bottom of the screen. And as for audio, there is no audio support in the game whatsoever. As for its current release date, this game was technically released as shareware, but again, it's unfinished, and the other games it promotes being able to acquire were never actually made. So I have my doubts any registered copies of this game were ever put out. In any case, if you want to grab a copy nowadays, one of the simplest places to acquire it is the DOS Games website at www.dosgames.com. Now, because this game is unfinished, you're going to notice pretty quickly that a lot of things don't work as expected. For instance, you get a main menu when you first boot the game with an instructions page. The instructions screen has 8 selections for the weapon shop, econo in, weapon combat, dark spells, shadow spells, light spells, characters, and the main menu. And not only do these instructions allude to there being multiple save slots, which there isn't, but all 3 spell sections and the character sections were never made and just linked to the help details for the main menu. Now, when you go to start a new game, you're able to choose between 4 character classes: Fighter, Thief, Mage, and Thug. Now, fighters and thugs don't have magic, while thieves and mages do, with each character class having different ranges to the initial stats they roll, as well as different weapons they can buy from the shop. Now, one thing that may be a bit confusing though at first is that one of the stats when rolling your character is referred to as maximum attack. Now, I'll go more in depth into how this stat works in a little, but all you need to know when initially rolling a character is that strength factors into attack power for all classes, while fighters also get an attack bonus from agility, mages get an attack bonus from intelligence, and thieves and thugs get an attack bonus from luck. You're then dropped into the game inside of Mortonville, the main town for the game, where you'll buy new weapons, stay at the inn for recovering and leveling up, as well as talking to the Oracle, which simply gives you a generic tip of some kind depending on your experience level, most of which are just flat out obvious. Now, I should quickly note too that the cost to stay at the inn varies by character class. 12,000 gold for mages, 12,500 for thugs, 12,750 for fighters, and thieves pay the most at 13,000 gold. Now, while that sounds like a lot, given that you start the game with only a few hundred gold pieces, you earn gold extremely fast in this game, so it's not a big concern. And once you head into the dungeons, the main gameplay will begin. Now here you're presented with a fairly large screen divided into several sections, but for the most part, the left side shows the player's stats, and the right side shows the opponent's stats, if you have an opponent. Anytime you don't have an opponent, you can head back to town, and regardless of anything, you can save your game in an instant at any time from here, though there's no message to indicate when a save is performed, it just happens silently. Now when faced with nothing, you just press enter to move on to whatever's next, though you can technically fight the nothingness and kill it, possibly getting health potions in the process, but doing this can cause some weird things to go wrong, such as no longer being able to go into the town, so I don't recommend taking advantage of this bug. When faced with an actual opponent though, the trick is to either run away from the opponent or kill it. Now if you're playing as a fighter or thug, this is effectively a numbers game, figuring out who has the better numbers to survive, though one stat that's hidden from you under most circumstances is your weapon's attack rating, which heavily factors into your maximum attack rating. Now by viewing your stats, you can see what your weapon's attack rating is, and keeping this number in mind is incredibly important at all times, as is your maximum attack, as every time you attack an opponent and score a hit, the damage dealt is a random number between 1 and your maximum attack. Thus your average damage output for every round of combat that hits your target is effectively half of your maximum attack. Now your maximum attack is based on 5 factors: strength, a class-specific stat, your weapon's attack rating, your experience level, which caps at 35, and a class divisor. Now on screen right now are the exact formulas for each character class. You'll notice that because your experience level multiplies straight into this, a single level up effectively doubles your initial starting power. And because similar math is used for your opponents, but you can't see their attack ratings, you want to judge whether to fight an opponent or not based on how quickly you can blast through their HP and how high their level is. As if their level is significantly higher than yours, they can probably burn through your HP faster. When you defeat an opponent, you get their experience points in gold, and there's a random chance for a health potion to drop, which restores a substantial chunk of your HP in the late game or all of it early on. Then you move on to the next encounter. Quite frankly, this whole process greatly reminds me of Moraf's World and Moraf's Dungeons of the Unforgiven. In fact, the message you get when you win, which says, "You killed it," is exactly the same. So I'm 99% certain the people who made this game were also fans of the old Moraf dungeon crawls. Might also explain why the numbers are kinda massive, as you're gonna have well over 100,000 hit points by the time you hit the level cap, though the cap of 999,999 gold is actually a little restrictive, and you'll be hitting that cap well before you even hit the level cap. All that said, the game is incredibly evil too. Even right from the start, you'll often encounter enemies which will flat out one-shot you if you don't immediately kill them or run away. But since you can save whenever, and saving always brings you back to town when you restore your game, it's not really that big a deal, just as long as you remember to do it. I kind of have this habit where I hit the S key to save right at the start of every single battle, no matter how I decide to handle it. And that's the basic gist of the game. You're just trying to become more and more powerful, and as you level up, you begin to encounter harder and harder opponents. But there's otherwise no end to it. And again, the game is unfinished, so there's effectively no proper ending to this sequence of events. So I generally just set myself a challenge of getting to 100,000 experience points and making it back to town, since you hit the level cap at around roughly 70,000 experience points. However, there's still a bit more to go into. Firstly, magic. Now, one thing to get out of the way is that enemies never cast magic. Again, one of those things that was never implemented yet was clearly planned, so you never have to worry about that. As for your own magic, mages and thieves each have their own set of 6 spells, some of which share some attributes, but they're all technically different. Plus the mage has 2 very special spells that they can cast whenever they have maximum hit points and maximum spell points. The trick with the primary spells, though, is that half of them are worthless. The healing spell is obviously very useful, and the amount you heal is based on your intelligence. In fact, it's the only spell which is. All other spells simply deal damage. And for the mage, Mangle is a really good spell because it's only 1,400 spell points to cast, but deals a fixed 17,500 damage. Whereas the next spell up, Swarm, costs 3,000 spell points, but only does 2,000 damage per level of the caster. Thus, you need to be at least level 9 for it to do more than Mangle, and level 21 before the ratio of SP to HP outpaces Mangle. The next mage spell, Jolt, is worthless. It does a fixed 64,000 hit points damage, which is a lot, but costs not 7,500 spell points as listed, because then it would actually be useful, but 12,000 spell points, meaning the next spell up, Fusion, which costs 10,000 and deals a fixed 70,000 HP damage, is just flat out better in every way. The final mage spell, Lava, costs 12,000 spell points and does 5,000 damage per level. Thus, you want to be at least level 15 before you start using it, but you'll be close to the level cap by the time its SP to HP ratio is decent. However, if your mage has maximum HP and SP when they go to cast a spell, you instead get 2 special spells to choose from. Mutilate for 64,000 spell points, and Death for 80,000. These spells do not require you to actually have enough spell points to cast them, though this effectively makes Mutilate worthless since it simply cuts an opponent's HP in half, whereas Death is an insta-kill spell. Generally speaking, if the first enemy you encounter after leaving town as a mage happens to be extraordinarily powerful by comparison, casting the Death spell will give you a huge boost in your experience and gold, that will leave you having to go back to town as soon as possible. Thief magic, on the other hand, is even more broken. The Mangle spell only costs 1,000 SP, but also deals 17,500 hit points damage, so it's just flat out really good. Curse wouldn't be so bad if it actually consumed 2,500 SP, but it actually costs 12,000 SP to cast, and only deals 24,000 hit points damage, so nope, it's worthless. Surge isn't terrible, but doesn't make sense at first, as it calls itself Jolt when you cast it, and says it's doing 72,000 hit points damage, when in fact it's only doing 45,000 hit points damage, but it does only cost 5,500 SP, so it's not terrible. The actual Jolt spell works as expected, while Lava also works as expected, and in fact will likely become your go-to damaging spell right around level 15, just like with the Mage. However, everything I've talked about so far is meaningless, as in none of it means anything to me in terms of game design. Everything I've gone over so far is nothing special, and given how buggy and unfinished it all is, not a single point of any of this is what made me want to keep playing this thing. But there's one final feature this game has, which, quite frankly, is the most ingenious thing in here despite not being fully realized. Every once in a while, when you defeat an enemy, you can claim their weapon. This was the feature that got my imagination going and made me want to keep playing, as in the back of my mind I was thinking about this with the same sort of logic like in Mega Man. Now, in the Mega Man games, you claim the powers of the boss robots you defeat, which in turn have all sorts of functionality, not just in terms of damaging opponents, but often in terms of utility as well. Now, here in Shadow Knight, the only thing the enemy weapons offer are various attack ratings, which is why it's important to keep the attack rating of your current weapon memorized, so that you'll know when you find a new weapon if it's better than what you've got. But what if a fiery weapon actually had a fire effect? Or what if you could have a weapon which could absorb health from an opponent or cast healing magic, among other effects? Suddenly, the concept of being able to replace your own mundane weapons with more interesting weapons made a whole lot of sense, and this became one of the core mechanics for one of the very few Windows 3.1 games I ever made, which I called RPG Fighter. Now, this game's not available on my website anymore for a number of reasons. The most pertinent being that it not only doesn't have a save feature, meaning you have to play through it in one sitting and have to start over if you die, but also it kinda crashes frequently due to integer overflow errors, since I wasn't being smart about the differences between regular integers and long integers. And since it's written in Visual Basic, and the BASIC language loves to stop execution over highly recoverable errors, this effectively makes it impossible to actually beat this thing, even though it does technically have an ending. But also, I started making this thing when I was freaking 14 years old and quote-unquote finished it while I was 15. So is it any wonder it doesn't work perfectly? The thing is, though, is that it not only has the same mechanic from Shadow Knight of being able to sometimes take enemy weapons, but some of the weapons in the game do indeed have special effects. For instance, two weapons you can get from the weapons store are the Fire Wand and Rod of Thunder, both of which have the ability to do extra damage, but with a chance of breaking the weapon if you choose to perform those attacks. Plus, one of the enemies you can end up fighting early on are sprites, which have the Pixie Wand weapon, which have similar stats to the Rod of Thunder, but also have the ability to heal the wielder, and yes, enemies in this game can use the special features of their weapons. Later in the game are even more crazy effects, like being able to halve an opponent's HP or even roll a chance of insta-kills. But the point is, most of these effects do not come from weapons you can get in the stores. You get them from weapons you swipe from enemies you defeat on a random chance, that they drop those weapons. To me, this mechanic had tons of untapped potential in Shadow Knight, thus why it inspired me towards my own game development efforts, and why I wanted to actually take some time to talk about it. Overall, Shadow Knight is broken, unfinished, buggy, loaded with spelling mistakes, and missing features. But is playable, which is kind of a surprising thing when you think about it. By all metrics we have to measure games by, this is the kind of game which should have stayed buried amongst all the other shovelware out there, never to again see the light of day. But because you can actually play through this to some extent, and because it has an extremely clever feature, even if it's not utilized to its maximum potential, it manages to stand out on that one merit alone. To that end, I would say it's definitely worth giving this game a quick look. Just don't expect it to hold your interest for too long, as a full run through to 100,000 experience points when you know what you're doing only takes about 20 minutes. Given how simple the game is and that nothing in it requires special timing or features, all you have to do is leave cycle set to auto in DOSBox and it should run perfectly fine. Well, as fine as an unfinished game can anyways. Anywho, that'll be all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. I'm still having to catch up on things outside of my show, as the past few weeks have just been one heck of a roller coaster. So up next, 2 Saturdays from now, on September 17th, will be yet another simple game review for episode 304. This time looking at a game which, believe it or not, came out of Intel. Yes, the company responsible for making the CPUs all of those old DOS computers utilized. So definitely be sure to stay tuned to see how such a game came to be and what it even is. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to everyone supporting me over on Patreon. If you'd also like to support the show directly and get some extra perks, then head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.